Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at the state of global alliances and U.S. foreign policy. And we're going to do it through the lens of one particular event, President Zelensky's trip to London, right after that really interesting meeting he had with President Trump.
Yeah, this should be a good one.
Yeah.
I mean, this trip really does seem to highlight a lot of the bigger trends and tensions we see in the world right now. So you've sent me some news reports and analysis pieces, and ready to go.
I think it'll be really interesting to see if we can answer some of the big questions that are out there right now, like, is the post-World War II order really on the verge of collapse? Has being a U.S. ally actually become a liability? And if this order does fall apart, what replaces it?
Yeah, those are big questions for sure.
Well, let's start with Zelensky's trip itself. So first you have this tense meeting with Trump, where Zelensky's criticized for not being grateful enough for U.S. support.
Right.
And then he goes to London and gets this incredibly warm welcome from European leaders. It's a pretty stark contrast.
Yeah. It really highlights the kind of the different approaches we're seeing, between the U.S. and Europe when it comes to global affairs. And we can't forget what British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said during Zelensky's visit. He made a point of saying that Europe needs to do more to support Ukraine, but he also said that for that to really work, there needs to be strong backing from the U.S.
It's interesting how he phrases that. He's acknowledging the need for European action, but he's also very clearly saying that the U.S. can't just disengage.
Right. It's definitely a message directed at the Trump administration, especially considering their, history of being closer to Moscow.
Exactly. And that brings us to U.S. foreign policy. And one particular analysis piece you sent over, written by Richard Haass.
Oh, yeah.
This guy has a long history in diplomacy. He served under 3 Republican presidents, and he's now the president emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations. So he's definitely someone who knows what he's talking about.
He definitely does.
And he doesn't mince words. He straight up says that the post-World War II world order, which has shaped global politics for decades, is basically on life support because of the direction Trump has taken U.S. foreign policy.
Wow, that's a pretty blunt assessment.
And when you think about what that order actually means, the U.S.-led alliances, international institutions like the UN, the push for free trade, all of that, according to Haass, is in serious jeopardy.
Yeah, it's a big deal if he's right.
And it gets even more concerning because he goes on to say that being a U.S. ally has actually become a liability in the current political climate.
It really makes you wonder if Europe can actually step up and fill the void if the U.S. continues down this path. I mean, can they do it alone?
Right. That's a question that Haass wrestles with, too. He acknowledges Europe's potential, but he's pretty skeptical that they could actually end the war in Ukraine by themselves.
Yeah.
They just don't have the same military power as the U.S.
Right.
So what happens if the U.S. says, okay, we're done, we're pulling out of Ukraine? What are the consequences?
Right. Well, Haass thinks that such a move would probably embolden Putin, make him less likely to negotiate, and, potentially lead to even more aggression in Ukraine.
So it would basically make a peaceful resolution even less likely, which is already a long shot as it is.
Exactly.
Okay, but what does winning even look like in this conflict? Can we realistically expect Ukraine to get back all the territory that they've lost?
Well, Haass is pretty pragmatic about this. He recognizes that it would be really, really tough for Ukraine to achieve a complete military victory.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a full-scale invasion here, not just some minor border dispute.
Right. So instead, he proposes kind of a different definition of success.
Okay, I'm listening.
He says a successful outcome would be a ceasefire that allows Ukraine to keep most of its territory. And then, from there, you can start a long-term process of negotiation with Russia.
So not a decisive win, but like a strategic stalemate that creates a chance for de-escalation.
Right. It's more realistic, and it prioritizes de-escalation over an all-or-nothing approach.
Which I guess connects back to Trump's America First philosophy, where U.S. interests are the top priority, even if it disrupts the existing global order. I mean, you think about his statement that the EU was formed to screw the United States.
Oh, yeah.
Those are pretty strong words.
They are.
And, it really does make you wonder if the U.S. is actually undermining the very system that's given it the strategic advantage for so long.
Well, that's exactly what Haass is arguing. He says that the U.S. is actively dismantling the post-war order that it worked so hard to establish.
Kind of ironic, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
It's like they're sawing off the branch they're sitting on. So if this continues, what happens next? I mean, worst case scenario, the current world order crumbles completely. What takes its place?
Yeah, that's a scary thought.
It is.
Well, Haass outlines a few possibilities. None of them are very appealing.
Oh, boy.
He suggests that we could see a world where disorder is just the norm, with powerful countries like China and Russia acting more aggressively to get what they want. And we could also see a resurgence of spheres of influence, where major powers just dominate certain regions. So, imagine a world where China calls the shots in Asia, Russia controls Eastern Europe, and the U.S. retreats even further into isolationism.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for more conflict, less economic prosperity, and less freedom for pretty much everyone.
It does, doesn't it?
It really makes you think that maybe the current world order, even with all its flaws, is still the best option we have.
Well, Haass seems to think so. He argues that a rules-based international system, even if it's not perfect, is still better than a chaotic and unpredictable world.
So at least we can agree on that.
Yeah, and there's another thing that I found really interesting.
What's that?
Haass admits that he was completely caught off guard by how much Trump's foreign policy has changed in his second term. He seems to have really doubled down on this America First approach. And it wasn't really something that he talked about a lot during his campaign.
So voters might not have fully understood what they were voting for.
Yeah, it's possible that they didn't grasp the full implications of this approach.
It's almost like a bait-and-switch situation in a way.
It is kind of. And that leads to another really important question. What are the consequences of this shift for everyday people? I mean, how does this actually affect you and me?
That's a great question. And that's exactly what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at how these global shifts could impact your daily life, from the economy to the potential for conflict. Stay tuned. It's easy to get caught up in all this talk about global order and foreign policy, but I think it's important to kind of bring it back down to earth a bit. How could all of this actually affect you and me in our daily lives?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it's something that a lot of people don't really think about. But, if these global alliances start to break down and countries become more focused on just their own interests, it could have ripple effects everywhere.
I was just reading an article about this, actually. It was talking about how all this uncertainty could lead to a lot of instability in global markets, which could then, impact trade and the prices of goods we buy here at home.
Exactly. We've already seen some of this with, the trade wars and all this stuff with tariffs. But imagine that on a much larger scale. Supply chains could get disrupted. Currencies could fluctuate like crazy. And businesses would have a really hard time trying to navigate this world where alliances are constantly shifting.
So we're not just talking about political chaos, we're talking about potential economic chaos, too.
Right. And then there's the increased risk of conflict. Without a strong rules-based international order to help resolve disputes, countries might be more likely to use military force. We could see more regional conflicts, proxy wars, even the possibility of confrontations between major powers.
It's starting to sound a bit like a real-life game of Risk, but with much higher stakes.
Yeah, and the consequences are a lot more serious than just, moving little plastic armies around a board. Beyond military conflict, a weaker global order could also embolden authoritarian regimes, and that could lead to a decline in democracy and human rights around the world.
So we've got economic instability, the threat of increased conflict, and a potential erosion of democratic values. Anything else we should add to this list of potential consequences?
Well, we haven't even talked about the potential impact on global challenges like climate change.
Yeah.
Addressing these really complex issues requires a lot of international cooperation. And a world without that cooperation not going to be able to handle them very effectively.
It's almost like we're on this runaway train and nobody seems to know how to apply the brakes.
It's definitely a pretty daunting situation. But it's important not to give in to despair or apathy. Understanding the potential consequences is the first step towards finding solutions and advocating for a more stable and cooperative world.
So let's shift gears a little bit. Let's move away from the doom and gloom and talk about what we can do. If we're not just passive observers in all of this, what are some actions we can actually take as individuals to make a difference? I think it's easy to feel powerless when you're dealing with these huge global issues.
That's a great question, and I think it's one that often gets overlooked. We may feel like our individual actions don't really matter on the world stage, but collective action can actually be a really powerful force for change.
So give us some practical advice. What are some concrete steps we can take to, feel like we're actually contributing to a solution, even in a small way?
Well, first and foremost, stay informed. Don't let the complexity of these issues or, the sheer amount of information out there overwhelm you. Seek out reliable sources of news and analysis. Engage in thoughtful discussions, and challenge yourself to really think critically about what you're reading and hearing.
So don't just, skim headlines and scroll through social media feeds. Actually dig deeper. Do your own research.
Right.
And try to understand the nuances of these global challenges.
Exactly. The more informed we are as individuals, the better equipped we'll be to make informed decisions and hold our leaders accountable.
Okay, staying informed is a great first step. What else can we do?
Get involved. There are so many organizations out there working to promote peace diplomacy and international cooperation. You can support their efforts by volunteering your time, donating to causes you believe in, or even just spreading awareness about these issues within your own networks.
So don't just sit on the sidelines and complain. Actually get into the game however you can. Find ways to contribute, even if they seem small at first.
Exactly. Small actions, when they're multiplied by millions of people, can have a really significant impact. And finally, don't underestimate the power of dialogue and engagement. Talk to your friends, family, colleagues about these issues. Share your concerns. Listen to different perspectives. And work together to find common ground.
So it's about, stepping outside of our echo chambers and having these constructive conversations with people who might have different viewpoints.
Exactly. Through dialogue, empathy, and a willingness to understand each other, we can bridge divides and work towards a more inclusive and cooperative world.
This is starting to feel a little more hopeful now. It's a good reminder that we're not just, powerless bystanders. We can actually shape the course of events, even in small ways.
And remember, history isn't set in stone. It's constantly evolving. And we as individuals and as a global community have the power to write the next chapter.
Okay, so far in this deep dive, we've explored the potential consequences of a weakening world order. We've talked about the importance of staying informed and taking action. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave you with one final thought. What if, instead of fixating on the negative, we shift our focus to what we want the future to look like?
That's a really interesting idea. Instead of just reacting to a potential collapse, we can proactively envision and work towards a better alternative.
Right. So let's explore that. What could this alternative world order look like? What are some of the key features?
Yeah, it is fascinating to think about what a totally reimagined global system could look like. And I think it's important to emphasize, we're not just talking about, fixing the current system, but really like fundamentally rethinking it. How do countries interact? How do we tackle these huge global problems? How do we build a more just world for everyone?
Okay, so paint me a picture here. What are we talking about? What would this alternative world order actually look like? What are the key elements?
Well, imagine a world where, international institutions like the UN are not only strengthened, but they're also reformed. So they actually reflect the realities of the 21st century. Imagine a world where diplomacy and dialogue are the main ways we resolve conflicts, not military force, and a world where we actually work together to address these global challenges. Climate change, pandemics, poverty, these things that affect us all.
So it's less about America first and more about humanity first?
Exactly. It's about understanding that we all have a stake in this. We need to get rid of this zero-sum game mentality and realize that we can all do better when we cooperate.
I like the sound of that, but it also sounds incredibly ambitious. How do we actually get there? I mean, how do we go from where we are now to this more, utopian vision?
Well, it starts with changing our mindset.
Yeah.
We have to move beyond fear and mistrust and this narrow focus on self-interest. We have to cultivate this sense of, shared humanity. We have to invest in diplomacy, conflict resolution, peace-building efforts. And we have to strengthen the international institutions that can actually, promote cooperation and collective action.
So it's about building trust and a sense of shared purpose.
Right. We need to understand that we're all in this together. We're facing these common problems, and they require common solutions. It's about, bridging divides, building relationships, creating more inclusive global community.
Let's bring this back to Zelensky's trip to London. We talked about how, he had these very different receptions in Washington and London. What do you think his visit says about the future of global alliances?
I think it shows that European leaders are increasingly, wanting to assert themselves more on the world stage, especially with all this uncertainty around U.S. foreign policy. Like we talked about, Prime Minister Starmer basically said, hey, Europe's ready to step up, but we still need the U.S. to be involved.
Yeah.
It suggests that, maybe we're moving towards a world where global leadership is more distributed, where you have multiple power centers working together.
So instead of one, dominant superpower like the U.S. has been for so long, maybe we'll see a more multipolar world with different centers of influence kind of collaborating and then sometimes competing.
Yeah, that's one possibility. And, it's important to remember that the future of global alliances isn't fixed. It's constantly changing. And Zelensky's trip is just, one piece of a much larger puzzle.
It's true. There's no way to know for sure what's going to happen. But I think we can use these events, these moments in history to kind of, analyze trends, understand different perspectives, and make better choices about the kind of world we want to live in.
And that's really the key takeaway, isn't it? We're not just passive observers. We have the power to shape the future, both through our own individual actions and through our collective engagement in these conversations.
Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our deep dive. We've explored a lot of complex issues today, from the potential collapse of the global order to the very real consequences for everyday people. And we've even, dared to imagine some alternative paths forward. So remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep those conversations going, because ultimately the future is ours to shape.